Mike's on Mike is made possible by contributions from listeners like you to the Jacksonville History Center. One city, many stories. Online at jackshistory.org.
Mike's on Mike, a conversation about politics, government, and Jacksonville, with 50-year opinion leaders Mike Hightower, Mike Tolbert, and award-winning broadcaster and longtime political observer, Mike Miller.
Welcome to another episode of Mike's on Mike. I'm Mike Miller, along with Mike Hightower, who is in the studio with us today. Mike Tolbert, as always, is back in his remote studio. And, of course, our program is brought to you by the Jacksonville History Center, where our friend Alan Bliss and his fine staff, along with the most generous donors, keep these cameras on and these lights rolling. No, the other way around. Lights on and cameras rolling. We'll take care of that in post-production. Anyhow, we're very happy to have our friend Mike Hightower home safe and sound from his recent visit to Ukraine. Mike's been in places and seen things that very few people, especially from Jacksonville, have witnessed, and next week you're going to hear much more about it, as he will be our special guest as well as co-host. But today our guest is Dr. Sean Frieder, an associate professor in political science and public administration department at UNF. He received his Ph.D. from the University of California. Dr. Frieder's research at UNF focuses on things like partisanship, motivated reasoning, selected perception and attribution, polarization, and voter behavior. In other words, he studies what we call unity politics, or in these days, the lack of any unity in politics. Given the divisive politics and climate in the U.S., we want to ask Dr. Frieder, what's causing all of this great divide, and is there ever going to be a day again when we still can disagree but do it with civility, where someone who thinks differently isn't considered an enemy or evil? And Dr. Frieder, great to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us on Mike's on Mike.
Welcome. Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
You betcha. And, Mr. Tolbert drew the short straw, so he's going to be the first one up.
Dr. Frieder, let's start by learning a little bit more about you. I'm particularly interested in how you got to UNF, but especially about the work that you're doing. Why did you choose this subject for your focus?
So I got into political science, I guess, for the same reason that this is the thing I'm focused on, which is I tend to have a penchant for the grandiose. I like the big world level story, what's going on. So that's what got me into politics in the first place. That's got my bachelor's in political science at University of Washington. I got my master's and PhD from Berkeley. So my interest has always been kind of at, politics, global affairs, and whatever happens to be the most contemporarily hot issue. And by studying polarization, I've essentially, one, locked myself into always studying that thing, and two, apparently being mildly depressed for the rest of my life. It is a dark field to study. I study polarization. I study persuasion, or as you put it, the lack thereof of persuasion that we see. So I intersect a lot with political psychology and generally neurology, how the brain works. So tend to focus on politics more from the side of the people watching politics, making sense of it. In terms of how I kind of got into studying this in the present moment, my work has really been dealing with kind of what we're hoping to talk about today, which is ways that we could potentially wind down polarization a bit. So some of my work is focused on causes of polarization, at least more immediate recent causes, focuses therefore a lot on social media, as you might imagine, which we will, I'm sure, discuss a little bit more today.
Yep.
Some of what I focus on primarily is what we call attribution in psychology. You mentioned it before. Attribution is the way that we try to understand why people who are not us want to do the things that they do. So why people do what they do, think what they think. And the field generally finds that people, if they're given someone in their in-group, they can do a pretty decent job of approximating what someone like them thinks and why they think that thing. And people start to do very poorly when they try and apply that same kind of idea to the out-group. So why does someone who disagrees with me believe what they believe, vote for the people they vote for? We're really bad at it. And so my research really established in a couple papers, when you think about why the out party wants something, you kind of just freeze, and what your brain delivers you tends to be mostly negative things. Why does someone disagree with me? Most common answer is genuinely something's wrong with their brain.
Something wrong.
They're wrong. They're wrong, and their brain's wrong, which is what made them wrong. So this can include things like they don't know the true knowledge. I have the true knowledge. They're just not that smart, so they can't take the facts and actually do something useful with it. Something in that category. And Democrats and Republicans alike, that's by far the most common thing that they think about the other side. Behind that are then things like what I labeled hostility. Generally believe someone wants something different from me because they're trying to harm someone. So they actively want Americans generally to do worse, or some maybe specific group within the United States to do worse. They know the policy will be harmful, and they are trying to cause the harm. You get that on both sides, somewhat more from Democrats than Republicans. On the flip side, you also get accusations of selfishness, of greed, of laziness, things where people are not doing what they should be doing and they don't deserve the things they're trying to get.
Sean, I got to interrupt.
Yeah.
All right. For those of you who are catching this program on Spotify or in any of our audio-only platforms, if you could only see the way Hightower is looking at me as Sean is talking about all of these things that the Democrats do that the Republicans don't. I could write a book on this guy, I'm telling you. But go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, I'm watching some of these reasons resonate with the in-studio folks as we talk in real time.
Now you know what it's been like for the last 3 years for me.
This is why even on the podcast, we can't have nice things to get allowed.
That's right.
I'm sorry.
No, so I mean, it's the reverse for explanations like that. You tend to get a bit more of Republicans saying things like the other side. They're lazy. They don't want to work for it. But you get that from Democrats saying that Republicans are selfish. The reason changes a little bit, but the general idea behind it, you don't care about other people.
There you go.
Yeah. It tends to fall into those three broad categories, but you tend to get a lot of that. You ask people why someone who agrees with them wants that thing, about 90% of the time they give some positive attribution for it. You ask someone about someone that disagrees with them, it's about a 40-60 split. 40% of the time they'll say something that is at least neutral. About 60% of the time they'll say one of those three things that I just mentioned.
Yeah. How deep is the political divide, really, Dr. Frieder? And what does the data show?
It is rough. This is not one of those close call kind of situations. I regularly tell my undergraduates in my classes that, we are breaking the new all-time high score for polarization every day when we wake up in the morning. I've studied this for, 10, 15 years now. Personally, I don't see an end in sight. If you'd asked me 10 or 15 years ago, I would have hoped something would have come along to save us from ourselves and cause that number to start tilting back in the other direction. I see zero evidence for that. I see a ton of reasons to believe that, 5, 10 years from now, we will have continued to have broken our old high scores, set new ones. The numbers are really bad. There's two ways you can look at them. You can look at measures of polarization amongst elites, which we have very good technical numbers. They're algorithm-based. We basically just feed computers votes from Congress, see how the relationship between party ideology and voting changes over the course of several decades. And there we see very clear, pronounced evidence of what we call ideological polarization. People really are at the elite level. Once they're voted into office, they seem to increasingly want different policies from one another. At the level of the masses, it's pretty different looking. The average thing that you get from the average person is they're just not paying that much attention to politics at all. So the idea that the average person's politics have ideologically polarized, moved to the left and right, we see relatively limited evidence for that. Now, if we divide into two other categories, if we look at the base, the people that vote and they vote intensely and they donate and they write letters to Congress, on the left and the right, you do see the clear evidence of polarization there. But if you're talking about your grandma, your mom, someone that's not maybe thinking much about politics, your friend down the street that hasn't voted in 16 years, that person's views probably have not changed much over time. But we do still see a huge increase in polarization amongst that group. It's not in their views, it's just how they feel about the other party entirely. So not necessarily driven by them wanting really different things from the other side. In fact, we tend to really overestimate how different the other side's wants are from our own sides. What we really see is what we call affective polarization. When it comes to measures of disliking, distrusting the other side, we use stronger language in surveys to kind of test them, like, do you consider the other side to be an existential threat to the well-being of the United States? You're getting now about 50% of partisans saying something like, the other side is not just disliked, not just hated, but they are the primary threat to the United States. And to put this in a little bit of perspective, you'd measure this back in, say, 1980. On a scale of 0 to 100, what we call the feeling thermometer for the other party, it's about a 45. Like, pretty neutral. You dislike the other side a little bit, but you mostly think, whatever about them. These days, the average is about 22 out of 100. So in order to get down to 22, that means a lot of people, when they're given 0 through 100, they are hitting 0, and that's it. And maybe some other people keeping it kind of afloat in the 40s, but it's a very, very low average, and it's just sunk over 40 years. There has not been upticks. It's just kept going down. And obviously, when you get as low as 22 out of 100, you start seeing a lot of the issues that you see today.
So it's really the intensity that has gotten out of whack.
Yeah, the intensity of feelings towards the other party. If you actually got 100 people in a room and sat them down and said, let's figure out what to do policy-wise, we'd see a lot more agreement than we would maybe expect to see.
What are the psychological and social causes of the polarization that we're experiencing? Maybe that you've answered it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll use this to kind of throw in my research. Like, if I have an elevator pitch, I have 20 seconds to tell people what I study, and why. It's sort of my overall take on polarization right now is we are where we are because we have a lack of attention. We have a lack of trust, and we have a lack of shared factual reality. We don't trust each other. We don't pay much attention. And when we do, we pay attention to two very different worlds of reality. So the psychological aspect is if you get people in a room with each other and they start trying to have a political conversation and they can't even agree on the basic facts of what they're talking about, that's a lot different than if they're sitting there talking, we agree on the facts, we just can have a conversation about morals or values. That's easier for people to have. When someone's saying this is true and someone else is saying this is not true, I know that it's not, you're not going to have that conversation go very well. And I think that's increasingly what we find ourselves dealing with is the psychology of facts, what is true, rather than the psychology of values and morals.
Is civility still something that is out there?
I think that's kind of the next step in this question of, why we see this as such a big issue. The civility's out there when it's three people in a room talking to each other. You have an expectation that I'm going to be in this same room with these three people next week and the week after that. And this is what we call a dynamic game in game theory. If you know you're going to play the game again, you have every incentive to make sure this is a smooth experience so that your next experience is smooth. Smooth being a relative term. It might not be that smooth, but you have some reason to pull a punch, to not say that insulting thing you'd maybe say in a different setting. So, if you imagine yourself talking politics in the 80s or 90s, you're talking to family, you're talking to friends, maybe a coworker, people that you have that expectation, you're going to interact with them again. So you're going to try and be on your best behavior. In the 2020s, the average person is seeing social media as their default way for people interacting with each other about politics. There is no expectation you'll see that person ever again. And you're doing it in front of an audience, so now you have every incentive to do the opposite of what you were doing before, be as nasty as possible. So I think civility can happen in what I like to call meat space. You're sitting around each other. We can have the civility we used to have. Online, it seems at this point nearly impossible to create those pockets where people can be civil.
What's your take on the relationship between social media and the political philosophies that are going on today, and what's going to happen?
I wouldn't assign it all the blame. A lot of what just politics is today is driving it, but I would assign it probably the lion's share of the blame. I would say the social media, and I would feel very comfortable. I guess I should say, as a scientist, saying something is a causal relationship, it takes a big leap for me to get to that point before I say it. Easy for me to say here. Social media has a causal relationship with polarization. The use of social media on an individual level, on a mass level, it's not the sole cause of polarization, but I would say it's primarily responsible, and in a couple different ways.
He also said that it's particularly influencing with Gen Z generation and causing that demographic to move towards the political right, which is kind of interesting because when I was what the Gen Z age is today, that was part of the old anti-war movement. That was going back to the 60s and the 70s when life was obviously quite different and the country was quite different. Your thoughts on that whole idea of Gen Z and where it's moving? Because you're talking to them every day in college.
In terms of like which direction social media pushes them, I would say that's a very temporary thing. In the 2024 election, I would say that we do have enough evidence now. It seems like use of TikTok, social media was pushing some younger people to the right. We've been seeing in kind of follow-up studies, and this is not surprising. We see similar effects 4 years earlier in the opposite direction. The elections happened, stuff is now occurring, and people look out at the world, and they weren't very strong in what they voted for in the first place. People that voted for Biden, a good chunk of them weren't very strong Biden supporters. That was just who they chose of the two. Same thing in 2024. Younger people, some of them moving towards Trump. We've seen a good chunk of those people already in approval polls moving back away from that original position. So I don't think social media is very good at winning one group or the other to one side permanently. Right. I think it's very good at getting people to engage with trends. That's what TikTok does. You know, most of these trends are not political, but when they become political, say Charlie Kirk becoming very popular on TikTok or other forms of social media, draws them in that direction for a while until a few years later, something else comes along, happens to become the popular thing. Before we were talking about Charlie Kirk and the impact on social media, maybe like right before the election, we would have been talking, say, in July of 2024 about Kamala Harris getting endorsed by Charlie XCX and having a brat summer and all these things that were very left-coded. So the pendulum swings back and forth in which direction it directs them. But I will say, sitting in a room with them regularly, if it's not happening on social media, it does not exist as far as Gen Z is concerned.
You know, Dr. Frieder, I got to tell you, as a political junkie and a former news hound, there was a time when I couldn't get enough political discussion. I always wanted more and wanted to engage. But I find it very difficult these days to have those kind of conversations with some of my friends and much anybody else, and I kind of avoid the news even more anymore. Do we know anything from political psychology about why people are disengaging from politics while others are clinging, you know, so tightly to partisan politics and partisan identities?
That's a great way to put it. So when we look at the effects of polarization on things like voter turnout, propensity to donate, have a political conversation, you do have exactly what you described there, differential effects. For some people that were maybe closer on the spectrum towards not being terribly interested in politics, it tells them run away screaming. So they see the polarization, they see a bunch of people yelling at each other about things they mostly really don't understand. They feel like, hey, if you're going to walk in that room, you're probably going to get your head taken off by someone for something that you didn't know that you did in the first place. They're going to say, forget it, I don't need that in my life. I'm going to do anything other than participate in that. For the people that like the conflict, and that is a significant chunk of people, not the majority to be clear, it is a significant minority, maybe 1 in 4, maybe 1 in 3, that really seem to enjoy the combative nature of politics. They're attracted to looking at rubbernecking on, the car crash on the side of the road. This is a great joy to them that they have more material to work with than ever. If you were someone that maybe 20 years ago would get ignored about talking about politics, now there's more space for podcasts about politics potentially, because people, at least that are intensely political, are interested in consuming that more. So I would say that for about half of the political spectrum, or half the country, it's an addictive problem almost. The algorithm certainly does not help with that. What we say, people would maybe be choosing news that agrees with them. Only maybe about half the time now are they actually actively choosing that. The other half the time, an algorithm is figuring out on their behalf what it thinks they would like. Someone gets, 8 hours of nothing but left-wing or right-wing content just because the algorithm says, I think you like this. And they don't know that they're getting an explicit stream one way or the other. So I think some people that want to get into this, they can dive as deep down the rabbit hole as they want. For those that, it seems nasty, they're more inclined to disengage than ever. And I will say, even for myself, someone that it is my job to remain engaged, the moment my job ends every day, I go home and I try and turn off my socials, turn off everything. I don't want to engage in politics because it really is. It's just a lot right now.
Are there any known conditions or interventions that can reduce political animosity between groups? And what are some of the successful strategies for bridging that divide? Is there light at the end of the tunnel, or is that a train coming at us?
Train. But before we get to the train, I do have some things that we could try to do. In short, the solutions are fairly straightforward. Things that we've seen work, they're just difficult to get people to actually practice, and they're difficult to scale so that lots of people are doing them. So, things like having a long, in-depth conversation with someone that you know and expect to interact with in the future, that is a good way of at least teaching people that when you actually sit down and have a conversation with someone, most people are reasonable people. They don't have the strong views that they may be expecting on social media. If you're expecting to get insulted just for opening your mouth, you sit there, have a conversation with your friend, your family member, your neighbor, the chance goes down. It doesn't go down to zero. We still see animosity between friends and family members, but having conversations with each other where the expectation is not that you're going to change the other person's mind. People become so obsessed with the idea that they're going to win this exchange that the win becomes all that they tend to focus on. So we find that generally, if you kind of create an environment where some rules are agreed upon beforehand, here's how long everyone's going to get to talk. We're going to have an opportunity with no gotcha questions. If I say, here's a piece of evidence I'd like you to consider, I'm going to have you look that up. And you're just going to consider it right there and then. You can ask me questions about it. No, like, you've never heard of that. I win this point. A discovery process as you'd expect to see in the law. Nothing, and this is similar to rules they have in Congress that, besmirches the intentions of the person sitting across from you. You assume that you're engaged in a good faith effort to understand where the other person's coming from. And if by the end of an hour, what you can say is, I think you believe this because of this, and can accurately describe someone else's reasons, and they can do the same for you, I would call that a victory. And in those cases, you do find that it's a long-term effect. Hostility goes down, understanding towards the other side goes up. And importantly, not just towards the specific person you just had that conversation with, but also generally towards the other side. Oh, I just learned by talking to my Republican friend, this is really why they believe the things they do. I'm going to apply that to the Republican Party at large and vice versa. So you can kind of train yourself to think better about the group as a whole by training on some good people close to you that you trust. Now, of course, as I said, the problem with that is scalability. The people that are the ones that most need to engage in that behavior are the ones that are going to most reject engaging in that behavior. As I said before, if you have an appetite for conflict, you're not looking to turn the temperature down, you're looking to turn it up. So the kinds of people that we'd like to practice these things are probably the least likely to practice them. The other issue is that these take skills, and they also take personality traits being a certain way. In the social sciences, there's a lot written about contact versus conflict theory. When you meet someone that's different than you, does it improve your relations with that group because you learn something new about them and that they're kind of human just like you? Or does it exacerbate the tensions because you see they're very different from you in all these ways? And the answer is, as far as we can tell, depends on the traits of the individuals engaging. If the people are high on what we call openness and agreeability, so they are willing to consider new ideas and they are liking the possibility of interacting with someone, even if they don't agree with them, those two people at the end of the experience, contact theory works. It reduces tensions. If you don't have that high openness and high agreeability, you get to the other result, which is it just exacerbates the tensions. And unfortunately, high openness, high agreeability is only a fraction of the population. So you're likely to just, for a certain fraction of the population, no matter how much you expose people to the other side, you're going to get nastiness, you're going to get hostility. So it makes it tricky to actually create that solution and sustain it. But on a person-to-person level, it's something that can be practiced and can work.
What about structural changes? Obviously, we all remember, of course, that the state of Texas is drawing their lines in order to try to get 5 more Republicans in their districts and so on and so forth. And other states now are trying to do the same thing. Newsom's trying to do it in California, pick up a couple of seats there. DeSantis is trying to do it here in Florida to pick up more Democrat or Republican seats here. Do those kinds of structural changes exasperate the polarization, or can it perhaps depolarize it depending on who's doing it?
So in terms of gerrymandering changes, we have looked somewhat at that even before this current episode that we're in. And one of the few things that seemed like a really good idea, that gerrymandering would increase polarization, there's not much that actually shows that that is actually occurring. People that are in gerrymandered districts are somewhat safer, but their views are not necessarily different from non-gerrymandered districts. At the same time, I can definitely think of some structural reforms that would make a difference, but kind of going back to the previous conversation, would be really difficult to implement in practice. The biggest structural reform I could think of would be to break the two-party system. The reason why people have really high polarization in the U.S. compared to other countries, I should also mention we aren't just hitting all-time high scores in terms of over time in the United States. We're hitting all world scores. We are beating all other countries in terms of internal partisan polarization. What do they have that we don't? Most of those countries are multi-party democracies.
Yep.
When you tend to create a two-party system, you tend to create a black and white way of thinking. People think of there just as being two sides you can pick. If you're against us, you're with the other side, etc. So we could try and move to a multi-party system, which would require rewriting the entire Constitution, which we're probably not going to do. So some of this is institutional, and it's probably baked into our system.
By the way, to my Democratic friends that are out there, one of the most well-known gerrymandered congressional seats was Corrine Brown, who had a district that went all the way from the south part of Jacksonville all the way to Orlando.
Yeah.
And that was gerrymandered back in the day.
Yeah, we've got a couple of famous ones right here.
Yeah, we do have a couple of famous ones here. And it's not just by one party. And people need to realize it's whoever happens to be in power.
Absolutely.
Who's got the 10?
Exactly.
Yep.
Who's got the 10?
Exactly.
And what, if anything, keeps you awake at night? And what, if anything, gives you hope?
Everything keeps me awake at night.
Welcome to our world, Sean.
Yes. I am finding it harder to sleep. That's been true since I started grad school for any number of reasons. It's continued right on. Thought tenure might make a difference. Tenure has not helped either. Still hard to sleep at night.
An honest man.
The things that give me hope, it is increasingly a short list. Things that used to be on my list have been knocked off the list. I would say one that if 5 years ago you asked me that question, I would actually say younger people today, that they're maybe more willing to engage in some of these conversations and talk to each other. I don't see evidence that that's true anymore. I think social media has made it more difficult than ever for them to engage with each other. I also think to a certain extent, they're finding it hard to make sense of how to understand the media at all. So media literacy is not necessarily a problem for my generation, your generation. It's really a problem for them. They start with, how do I find a news source with zero bias? And the answer is, you don't. You read across a variety of news sources that each have their own particular biases. You note them. That means you have to do the work. And unfortunately, they want a quick answer to that. They don't want to go and do a lot of research. Now, there's a way around that, which is not a solution. It's what keeps me up at night more than ever, which is AI. You could have AI scour various news sources for you and try and figure out sort of like a holistic understanding of the world. But my main problem with that is we are outsourcing our neurons to the building of a different neural network. We are getting dumber as something else that a corporation owns is getting much smarter. So I do not see that as a solution. I see, when I said before, we have a attention deficit, we have a trust deficit. AI is going to take what was already a fire and pour gasoline on it. So I know I was supposed to say something hopeful there, but I mostly, if I'm really being honest, it's a bleak field. There is not a lot right now that makes me feel like there's a solution around the corner to this. To a certain extent, and you guys aren't going to like the answer to this, there is a generational divide in political views. So I do think that once baby boomers in 20 or 30 years are maybe no longer active voters or with us, that might reduce the amount of polarization across parties because younger people, Democrats and Republicans, have somewhat more similar views. But given changes and given how much hostility there is right now amongst younger people on the left and right, I don't really necessarily feel that way either. I think we're going to probably continue to see polarization even amongst younger generations. So I hate to end that on a bleak note, but I don't find much in terms of hope right now. It is a dismal science.
Well, thank you, Sean, so very much for your
absolutely great.
This has been just phenomenal, just phenomenal. And as a reminder, by the way, next week we're going to be talking with this guy over here, Mike Hightower, who just returned, of course, from a 2-week stay in the Ukraine. Has so much to try. And I'm sorry I said the Ukraine. I meant to say Ukraine. You're not supposed to say the anymore. But anyhow, he had just quite a trip that he's going to be sharing with everybody, and we'll have that for you next week, and we'll look forward to that. Thank you all for joining us. Once again, my thanks to the Jacksonville History Center for bringing us our podcast, and we hope to see you again next week. Take care, everybody.
Take care. Thanks, bye.
Mike's on Mike. with Mike Tolbert, Mike Hightower, and Mike Miller can be found on your favorite podcasting platform, Facebook, and YouTube. Visit the website at mikesonmike.com. Join us next time for more conversation with Mikes on Mike.